I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing that you know that much about your invited speaker. I want to thank you, Matthew, for that introduction, and I also want to thank Claire St. Peter Pipkin and Rogelio Escobar, who are my co-authors on a chapter that's coming out on the topic of operant extinction, who helped clarify some of my thinking about it as I was organizing this talk and the chapter. I want to talk about 4 aspects of operant extinction today. I'm going to talk a little bit about definitions. Then I'm going to talk about eliminative effects and generative effects, and I'll end the talk by talking a little bit about implications of some of this work. I should say at the outset that I took the title of the talk literally, that this is to be a tutorial. And so it's going to be pretty basic, basic back to behavior of organisms. For some of you, there may be some new stuff there. For some of you, it's going to be pretty old hat. So if you choose to leave now, I won't be offended. If you want to sit back and relax and enjoy a trip down memory lane, stick around. So let's start with this simple statement that we often see and often say, that responding was extinguished. This is a statement that's pregnant with hidden complexity. There's a lot more to extinction than meets the eye, as we have seen in the last day or so at the SQAB, for those of you that went to the SQAB meeting. Responding was extinguished. It means 2 things. It can either mean a set of procedures or combination of procedures in the context or in concert with the changes that occur in behavior. And sometimes people mean one, sometimes they mean the other. In terms of procedural definitions, let's look at those first. Discontinuing the consequences previously maintaining responding is generally how we would talk about it. But what does that really mean? How do we talk about extinction in that context? What's a discontinuing operation? Well, it turns out that if you look at positive and negative reinforcement, if I may be allowed that distinction still, there are several operations, or there are 2 kinds of operations that one talks about, or one sees talked about when one discusses the concept of extinction. Looking first at positive reinforcement, the most common one is to simply remove the food. I'm going to use food and shock as my prototypes here, and I'm going to call shock a negative reinforcer, even though that raises objections by some people. And I'll talk about food as a positive reinforcer. So we remove the food. That's one way to do it. That's the most widely used extinction procedure. A second way that's probably less well studied and not always thought of as an extinction procedure, but to my thinking and to other people's thinking clearly is to remove the response-food dependency, or the response-food relation or contingency. In the case of negative reinforcement, things get a little more interesting. The most common procedure in the laboratory for extinguishing responding is to turn off the shock generator. So you've got an animal responding on a sibilant avoidance schedule, unplug the animal, and we remove the shock continuously. To me, when I think about that procedure, it sounds more like a disestablishing or an abolishing operation than it does an extinction operation. It's more like presenting the food continuously, which would abolish the establishing operation in the case of food, and by the same token, by removing the shock entirely, we're basically giving the animal all the reinforcement all the time. And in that sense, I'm thinking of it as more like an establishing operation. I can't think of an equivalent operation for removing the response reinforcer dependency in the case of negative reinforcement. In the case of the other operation for extinguishing negatively reinforced behavior is to remove the contingency between shock and between the response and the elimination of the shock, so that the shocks are now occurring continuously. That procedure is the procedure that's used most commonly in applied behavior analysis. For example, with kids that have these strong food preferences and won't eat, one of the classic techniques for extinguishing food-maintained escape behavior is to simply hold the food right at their mouth So the kids can't escape from the food. It's just always there. So the negative reinforcer, in a manner of speaking, is always present. And that's how I'm organizing this talk anyway, is around those four ideas. So that takes care of the procedures. What about the functions? We talk often about an extinction procedure was implemented with the effect of what? Typically, the effect of extinction is to eliminate, reduce, or suppress behavior. But extinction has another effect as well. It can generate, induce, or facilitate behavior as well. And I want to talk about both of those effects of extinction because most of the way that we talk about extinction involves the former. Let's talk first about eliminative effects of extinction. Elimination has many meanings in our language. Let's talk first of all about how we introduce extinction. We begin our trip down memory lane now. We can introduce extinction abruptly, or we can introduce it gradually. We can also introduce it in the course of the response being acquired. Bear with me while I explain that in a minute. Or we can introduce it during steady state responding. A classic example of introducing it during response acquisition is the old classic work of Terrace on errorless discrimination learning, where Terrace basically trained a discrimination between two stimuli, one correlated with extinction, the other with food reinforcement. In the presence of the extinction stimulus for one group of animals, of course, the responding, the absence of responding was in essence shaped. The extinction stimulus was introduced early in training. It was introduced very briefly and at very low intensity. It was a light for a pigeon. So you get a green light that's very dim and very short, and then over time it increases. For the other group, the extinction stimulus was introduced abruptly and after there had been some training of responding to the on the other schedule, on the VI schedule. And the effects on extinction responding were pretty dramatically different. Very high rates of responding when it was introduced late and suddenly, very low when it was introduced early and gradually. Terrace made some claims about some other effects that this kind of introduction of extinction had on other learning circumstances, things like inhibition and behavioral contrast, that are really beyond where I want to go with this. I'm just using it to introduce the ways in which we talk about extinction. More commonly, extinction in the case of positive reinforcement is introduced abruptly after first reinforcing the response, and we get the kind of classic learning curve or extinction curves that are shown here from Skinner's Behavior of Organisms. 4 rats with a gradually cumulatively decreasing response rates over time. In the case of negative reinforcement, here's an example. This is an example where after training on Sidman avoidance, the shock was simply turned off, and the rate of responding during 2 situations where responses either had previously postponed postponed shocks for either 20 seconds or 40 seconds were examined, and you see the same kind of classic extinction curves. Actually, the extinction occurs fairly quickly over the course of 2 to 3 hours. There are some other ways of introducing extinction gradually after a response has been established. One way would be to, in the case of pigeons, for example, one might take a VI schedule with, say, 30 inter-reinforcer intervals and gradually decrease the rate of reinforcement by picking out one of the intervals every day for 30 days or so. Now, you may ask why someone would want to do something like that. Well, I hate to tell you, I did it just to see what would happen. And I can tell you I wasted 30 days of my life. It wasn't very interesting. Except that, you know, it just prolongs the extinction process. It was agonizing for the pigeon and agonizing for me. Actually, I was interested in whether or not I could reduce behavioral contrast by doing this. I thought if I introduced it gradually, extinction gradually, I might not get behavioral contrast, but I did. Anyway, in the applied literature, there's something called schedule thinning, which is very similar, but it differs in a couple of ways. I mean, it's the same principle. Applied behavior analysts seem to use this as a way of establishing a generalization effect in the sense of Stokes and Bayer, of training, doing something to train generalization. And the way that it works is just like I described. It basically is just a reduction in the rate of in the inner reinforcer interval. Usually it doesn't reduce to zero, and there are reports that this has some effect on maintaining responding over the long haul. I think of it more as a local extinction effect in the sense that locally the rate of reinforcement is occasionally zero. I don't want to pursue that too far, but I think the important thing is that when you remove the reinforcer like this, it's unrealistic to expect the behavior to maintain. If they would get rid of the reinforcer altogether, it would go away. The fact that it doesn't suggests to me two things: either that the remaining reinforcers are sufficient to maintain the responding, or, probably more likely, some kind of alternative reinforcement has been established in the course of eliminating or thinning out that schedule. I don't know that that's the way that it really is, but that's kind of my reading of what transpires under those conditions. Let's look a little bit at some of the variables that affect response elimination during extinction. I'm going to talk mostly about positively reinforced responding because that's about 99% of the literature on extinction, and most of it's pretty old, as you're seeing. There's really not a lot of stuff on the effects of the schedule of reinforcement. This is from, this little diagram is from George Reynolds' primer, and it does make the point that when the effects that you get in extinction depend on how the behavior was established in the first place. And basically the patterns of responding in extinction will differ as a function of the schedule of reinforcement. So you either get a break and run pattern or a gradually diminishing effect. Of course, in the end, they all end up in the same place, but the effects are locally, at least, the effects are somewhat different. Responding is more resistant to extinction when positive reinforcers are more frequent, more immediate, and in the words of one of my grandchildren, more bigger. Here are some examples from some of Tony Nevin's work that involved multiple schedules, either multiple schedules where the components were VI schedules that varied in rate of reinforcement, VI2 versus VI6, in delay of reinforcement, a short delay or a long delay, or a large magnitude and a small magnitude of reinforcement. And the effects are fairly consistent there, as you can see. We're looking, if you look at the the right graphs here, and these two graphs are all based on normalized or proportion of baseline response rates. So the effects are pretty orderly there, as I described, more or less. That effect seems to hold up pretty well in the case of multiple schedules. But if you look at other kinds of schedules, like if you look at single schedules and some of these effects, it's a little messier in terms of what extinction really looks like there. This is an applied study by Lehrman and some of her colleagues where problem behavior was appropriate behavior was either maintained by 20-second, I can't remember if it was 20-second access to an activity. For some kids, they did a functional analysis, so there were different reinforcers, but the point is that there was a large one and a small one, a long duration, short duration. And it's very difficult. This study has some other issues too. I mean, the rates are not all that different between the two conditions, but Barring that, the differences in they first trained the response and then they extinguished it, and they did that for both the large and small magnitude of reinforcement. It's very hard to see any systematic differences in extinction as a function of these magnitudes in any case. Let me collect my thought here. There are, well, let's see. Okay. There are a couple of other situations where this same thing occurs. Billy presented some data yesterday on rate of reinforcement that showed similar kind of thing, that rate of reinforcement was not terribly sensitive. There were not differences in resistance to extinction as a function of rate of reinforcement, if I was reading your slides correctly.
Higher the rate, the faster the extinction.
Rate of reinforcement.
Yes.
Okay, you did find that. I misinterpreted. Anyway. The problem with, one of the curses of single subject designs is that things have to occur in some order, and if you want to compare different conditions in terms of their the effects of extinction on those conditions, you have to run them in some order. In the case of a reversal design, you have to have either, if you're comparing VI and VR, one of them has to come first. If you're using a multiple schedule, one of the components has to come first. And what happens during extinction in the first instance may have an effect on responding in the second instance. There's another study by Anger and Anger that provides some data on this. This is an experiment that shows repeated exposure to extinction where I think it was 5 or 7 days of training on a VI schedule in rats were followed by 5 days of extinction, and this procedure was repeated 12 times. And what you see over time is that the this is the first, 6th, and 12th exposure to the extinction. And what you see over time is that the initial effect, at least, is somewhat diminishing over time, which is what you would expect. It's like almost like a formation of discrimination between the two. Interestingly, there is at the end, after the response initially decreases from the baseline, it doesn't ever quite go to 0, even if after 12 conditions. And you said something about that yesterday as well in the case of Pavlovian conditioning. Let's look at the response. So I think, well, let me see, where am I? Yeah, that's the only point I wanted to make. I think that when you're dealing with these comparisons, sometimes some of the results get a little confounded by the fact that the animals have a prior history of something else. Let's look at some of the effects of removing the response reinforcer dependency. There are a few experiments that have compared the removal of the response reinforcer dependency with conventional extinction, that is, eliminating the food altogether. Here's one by Rescorla and Scusi, in which, after training on a VI schedule, responding was either conventionally extinguished, removing the reinforcer, or the random condition was simply removing the response reinforcer dependency. And responding is higher in that case than it is during conventional extinction. Not surprising, but this is an experiment that I did some time back where animals were trained. These were rats. They were trained on a multiple FI-VI schedule. And then they were, at different points in the experiment, were subjected to either a condition where the response reinforcer dependency was simply removed, or responding was, the reinforcer itself was removed. You can see that both operations reduced responding. The responding, of course, dropped off much more quickly, as it did in Rescorla and Scusi with conventional extinction. With removal of the dependency, there was a difference. There's no difference here really between formerly FI and VI responding that I can pick up. There's a clear difference with FT and VT. with the FT maintaining much higher than the VT. This is FT overall rates and terminal rates, so those are essentially both FTs. And here's the VT. So there do seem to be some subtle differences between removing the response reinforcer dependency and simply removing the food, which raises the question of, is extinction extinction? And by this, I mean, what other behavioral processes are going on? If we look at our 4 operations that constitute extinction, 3 of them involve a stimulus change, a big stimulus change. Food, no shock, shock. The one that doesn't is this one. I say no stimulus change. There could be a small stimulus change there because the response reinforcer dependency is discriminable. But it's much less discriminable than the removal of food. And so one of the confounds in talking about extinction, if we want to talk about it as some kind of response weakening effect, as Billy did yesterday, in line with what he said yesterday, I think, is the fact that one of the things that we have to consider is that there is a discriminably different situation, and that has a response-reducing effect, may have a response-reducing effect as well. Satiation effects, another problem with response-independent food is or response-independent events is removing the response reinforcer dependency is the potential effect of satiation. One of the preferred treatments in applied behavior analysis is to introduce a fixed time schedule. One of the things that happens with a fixed time schedule in many of the experiments is that the rate of reinforcement increases because the fixed times are very short relative to the reinforcement in the baseline condition. There are a couple of applied studies that have examined this, and they have found some evidence that satiation is a contributing factor to the reduction. A third consideration with response-independent events is adventitious reinforcement and the possibility that adventitious reinforcement is maintaining responding in the case of food and perhaps punishing responding adventitiously in the case of response-independent shocks delivered after avoidance conditioning. Those are considerations that we have to. It depends on what we want, how we want to interpret the extinction effect. I want to talk about one other procedure very quickly that's related to extinction, and these are particularly have some significance in applied work. DROs and DRAs. Functionally, a DRO is no different than extinction until the animal bumps into the first reinforcer after it pauses for a certain amount of time. So to that point, the schedules are identical. Probably the same thing is going on in a DRA, although there's no contingency in a DRA that pause or anything is required, but presumably at some point the organism shifts from one response to the next, and when it shifts to that next response, it can be reinforced. And it's the same kind of shift in both. So it's just a question of whether you're going to specify topographically a new response or you're going to let the response cast its fate to the wind, in a manner of speaking. This is an experiment by Zeiler where he trained animals, pigeons, on a multiple FR-FR schedule before either changing one of the components to DRO or the other to extinction, with the effect that the DRO consistently produced lower rates, or I'm sorry, consistently reduced responding more than extinction. The two vertical lines here and here, the animals had, I think, a 10-day break, and interestingly, too, spontaneous recovery occurred only in the extinction component and not in the DRO. This is a similar experiment that was done instead of using conventional extinction, using a yoked VT schedule with similar effects. The DRO was more effective in reducing responding than removing the response reinforcer dependency. This effect is not always obtained. Rescorla and Scusi found, you can argue that there's a difference there. It's really, it would be the difference between the random and the delay condition. The delay condition was essentially a DRO. There's maybe a slight, the delays, the DRO is maybe slightly lower than the random or the VT, but it wasn't statistically significant. There are other experiments that have produced a variety of mixed results, and it's not surprising because these schedules, these experiments differ along so many dimensions, different baselines, different durations of training in the baseline, different DRO values, even different ways of arranging the DRO, of which there are several. In application, I think of application as more of a combo platter. In application, extinction, of course, was the first of the first standardly used treatment procedures. But people later discovered DROs, and then they discovered that maybe it would be an even better idea if we specified some specific alternative response instead of just any response other than the problem response, so we can have sort of kill two birds with one stone, as it were. And so the favored treatment in applied work now seems to be a DRA. But an important element of the DRA, it remains extinction, at least as an operation. So let's turn and look for a moment at extinction and the generation of behavior. There are several examples of how extinction brings about other behavior. Any of you that have ever worked with a keyboard, I don't know how many of you have done that, and you're typing along and all of a sudden you hit the A key and nothing happens. What's your first response? You know, you hit the A key again, right? And then you hit it a bunch more times before your behavior finally drops off. Well, that's an extinction burst, and apparently it's a very commonly reported effect, and it must be considered a generative effect of extinction. There's an interesting meta-analysis by Learman and Awada where they looked at, I believe it was 95 experiments in applied behavior from Java. They looked at several different cases, but the one I'm interested in is where the treatment was extinction alone. They found that only in about 30% of the total cases were there reports of extinction bursts, which is kind of an interesting finding, and it goes against everything that we've ever learned about extinction. I don't know the details of their analysis, but these extinction bursts may be fairly short-lived, and if your analysis is very, very large, if you're looking, for example, at a whole session as opposed to moment by moment, like with a cumulative record, you may well miss it. And there are a lot of different procedures that are lumped in together here, so it's really hard to tell how general the extinction bursts are. I mean, you see isolated reports of them, but I don't think that there are any systematic studies of extinction bursts. Maybe there are, but I haven't found them. Spontaneous recovery was discussed a lot yesterday. It's simply I showed you an example earlier, and it is another example of responding being generated during extinction, this time by a temporary pause in the exposure to the extinction contingencies. There's also increased variability in response topography. Usually these are responses that are similar to, and I'm going to use the word similar to in quotes, the reinforced response. This is from an old experiment in which pigeons were exposed to a horizontal array of response keys, and responding was reinforced on an FR1. You can hardly see it. I'm sure you can't see it in the back. I thought I'd have a bigger screen, but the open bars are the responding in the presence of CRF, and they tend to be focused in one area of the operandum. And during extinction, after 6 days of extinction, you can see how the behavior spreads out. And so we get this kind of inductive effect of extinctions, this generative occurrence of other topographically related but further out responding. Extinction-induced responding. Any of you that have ever put money into a drink machine and had it fail on you have experienced this, I'm sure. I certainly have. It was, of course, institutionalized by an old experiment by Azrin and his colleagues where pigeons responding was extinguished, and if there was another pigeon available, lo and behold, we get a lot of attacking directed toward that pigeon. This seems to be a general effect of extinction, this induced responding, and the kind of behavior that's induced tends to be a function of the organism's either phylogenetic history or current circumstances, depending on what's there. If a wheel's there, a rat will run. If a drink tube is there, a rat will drink, and so on. That's an old finding. Here's another old finding that's, I think, an interesting one. Stimulus generalization in extinction. If we train responding in a discrimination between a green and a red light, and the red light has a vertical line on it, after the discrimination is trained, if we vary the orientation of the line from vertical to horizontal, we find that as we move away from the negative stimulus, often there is an increase in responding that's generated. These are called inhibitory generalization gradients, for those of you that don't know that, and they've been taken as evidence of extinction as being an active process rather than a passive one. Another generative effect of extinction is reinstatement. And this was talked about yesterday as well. This is an example from an experiment that I did. Rats were trained on, at different times, same rat, different circumstances, on either a DRL or a variable ratio schedule. After that, responding was extinguished to 0, and after that, a fixed time schedule was introduced. The fixed time schedule was introduced at the point of the arrows, and you can see that after responding is reduced to 0, if the fixed time schedule is introduced after a history of DRL responding, we get a little bit of increase in responding, but not much. But if it's after a variable ratio, we get a lot. So the response is differentially reinstated as a function of the organism's history. Renewal was also talked a lot about yesterday. It turns out that Skinner did an experiment on renewal in 1950. The experiment, renewal is simply changing the stimulus conditions during extinction and then changing them back to what they were before. In one example of renewal that's shown here, was pointed out yesterday, they seem to be two aspects of one reality having to do with contextual learning. It's just that the kinds of stimuli that are involved, whether it's an exteroceptive stimulus like a light or food, functioning as the discriminative stimulus. The final example of extinction generating responding I want to talk about is resurgence. And I'm going to illustrate it with, I think, what I thought was an extremely clever experiment by Bruzak and some of her colleagues who gave undergraduates a screaming baby, a screaming simulated baby. The only way to calm the screaming stimulated baby was to move it up and down in a vertical position like this. And hence, you see a lot of up and down movement in the training condition. 2 other responses were measured, feeding and playing, and they stayed rather low. It's interesting not only because of that procedure, but it's one of the few instances of resurgence of negatively reinforced behavior. In the second phase, the vertical rocking was no longer effective in calming the screaming infant. And you can see what happened to the behavior. It eventually extinguished. This is the first day of extinction, and here's the second day. So the behavior is pretty much gone by the end of the second day. At the beginning of the third day, an alternative response was reinforced. In this case, it was feeding, and feeding was reinforced to this point at which, and notice too that there's a little increase here, but basically rocking stays low. When we extinguish the feeding response, however, we get an increase or resurgence of the previously reinforced response. This, too, is not a new phenomenon. Resurgence was first discussed in 1950 in a dissertation at Columbia University, and it's called regression, but it's exactly the same thing. And it seems to be a general property, and I think of it in terms of a behavioral history effect, because what you get here in resurgence depends on what was trained over here, and there are a number of experiments that demonstrate that. It's not surprising in applied behavior analysis that it's become interesting, because when you extinguish one response, you expect to induce or generate other responses. And those other responses are going to be a function of the organism's history, which may be good news or bad news. If they're responses you want to see, it's good news. If they're not, then it's really bad news. So it can go either way, and it depends exclusively on the animal's or the organism's history. How are we doing on time? Okay. Time to quit. Okay. I'm going to skip through the first part of the implications, and let me just talk a little bit about the theoretical implications. One of the questions is whether or not extinction has permanent or situational conditional effects, and I think that question has been pretty much answered, that the effects of extinction is situational conditional, and there are many examples in what I've shown you here of that. Another set of questions have to do with whether it's an active process or a passive process. What are the behavioral mechanisms in extinction? An example of a passive process would be Skinner's reflex reserve. You build up the reflex reserve with responding, and when you extinguish it, it simply drains out. All the behavior's gone. So it's a very mechanical and very passive kind of process. Another process that may be going on in extinction is the learning of other behavior. It's most explicit with the DRO schedule, but it's present in other circumstances too. Inhibition has been suggested as being something that's learned by some people. Some people have suggested that it's learned during extinction. And of course, there's the distinction that we talked about earlier about discriminated and strengthening effects of extinction. Does extinction have its effects because of discriminative properties, or is it because it's weakening behavior? And of course, there's the question of the respondent-operant extinction relation. Are these two similar or not? I did want to mention that I normally refer to respondent conditioning as Pavlovian conditioning, but my son has taught me to say respondent conditioning. Okay. I'm going to have to quit at that point. I'm sorry that I ran over. I got a late start. So when you hear the expression responding was extinguished, I hope you will have an appreciation of some of the complexity and some of the considerations that you need to take into account in evaluating that statement. Thank you.